So welcome to the seminar for today. I'm the convener who I sent you emails, which is Arjun. Thanks for the presenters for this month's seminar. They're gonna be presenting researching the motivations for and influence of science outreach. So hope we get some of it.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hajin, for organizing and moderating this seminar, and welcome everyone in the room and online. My name is Jan van Driel, and I will present this seminar together with my colleagues Victoria Millar and Maurizio Toscano. I want to start by acknowledging that this meeting takes place on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I want to extend that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have made and are making contributions to the university community. So this seminar will be about researching about science outreach, and we're doing research on the motivations and the influence on science outreach, as you can see on the title page of this slide. We have prepared a presentation of about 45 minutes. We haven't timed it very accurately, but there should be time in the last 15 minutes or so for Q&A with people in the room and, of course, people on Zoom. Let's see how I get to the next slide. How does that work? I thought... Oh, sorry. I was looking at the wrong place. Thank you. Thanks, Hajin. We really need you here. So science outreach, first of all, of course, we need to explain what we're talking about. So on this slide, you can see some introduction to the idea of what science outreach is. As it's the way we frame it is a model of informal education, informal science education that is run by people from universities, scientists who work in industry or in science museums or other public and private science institutions. And we'll talk a bit more about the aims, but generally the aim of science outreach is to promote science to school students, to enhance their science literacy, their interest, their engagement, or also their retention in science outreach. Oftentimes, science outreach aims to students to pursue or to continue to study science and even take up or consider a career in science. Science outreach often provides access to science, to practices and to scientists, to people that are usually otherwise not available to students. That's an important part, I think, of science outreach. No, I'll do. So, summarizing the previous slide into a definition, because there are various definitions of science outreach out there in the literature. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We have framed as a team this particular definition where science outreach targets young people. It can be really young, but up to 18 years. So basically school-aged children and even earlier, even younger, and can have or intends to have a couple of outcomes. So the outcomes can be diverse, and of course outreach programs may focus or combine some of the intended outcomes on this slide. So it can be about understanding of science and the nature of science. It can be about engagement with science, inspiring future participation, but also fostering trust and valuing of science, which I think is something that has become probably more important in the last couple of years when there is so much misinformation and lack of trust in science. So the way we frame science outreach, we see it as a specific form of science engagement. Science engagement we see as a much broader set of activities that could also include science communication, citizen science, and is not limited, of course, to young people specifically, but could also target the public more broadly and more generally. There are many different programs in existence when we look at science outreach. And what we see also is that almost every university, as far as we are aware, and referring to this paper from 2018, provide some kind of outreach, but the types and the scope of those programs vary enormously. And specifically in the last couple of decades, we've seen a very large increase of science outreach programs globally. There is, in this paper from 2008, that's already 17 years ago, estimates at that time that 50% of active scientists participate in some kind of a science outreach. Now, that can be that participation can range from just giving a lecture once per year or running a program with workshops more substantially. But it's, I think, quite important to be aware that so many scientists are involved in a particular kind of science outreach. And so first of all, of course, when we go into this and this domain of science outreach and we start doing research, we need to know what is already known about science outreach, about what it entails and also what it achieves. So together with our colleagues, Cristina Gorella and Julia Hill, we worked on a systematic literature review, looking at what are the aims, the characteristics, but also what is the quality of the research on science outreach reported in the literature. It was just last week accepted by the journal Studies in Science Education, so it will be, we can be sharing it with you, this paper, very shortly. We included 86 publications in this lit review, and very briefly summarizing the outcomes is that there was a lot of variation and a lot of vagueness about what science outreach actually means and how it is defined. So there's a lot of conceptual fragmentation, not very consistent. A lot of the papers don't even define science outreach. They describe it more broadly, or they don't define it at all, just take it for granted, which we think is a problem. There's also what we see if you look into what those programs are, the way that they are designed is often not well aligned with what the intentions are. So if the intentions, for instance, is that they want students to consider studying science or a career in science, the design can be limited to one lecture or one activity that is unlikely to have that long-term impact. And the research is also often not well aligned with those intentions. Most of the research is done, is limited to an evaluation of the activity, whether it's a workshop or an experience that students are provided with, in terms of whether the students enjoyed it, whether the students found it interesting, but the longer term impact is often not researched. And there's also quite a few challenges that we found in terms of the quality of the research. Instruments, methodological quality is often problematic. We applied a particular quality assessment tool to those papers. Again, I won't go into this right now, but that will be part of the publication. There's also often a conflict of interest. That is, the people who design and provide the outreach are also the people who evaluate or research the outreach, which could obviously lead to a bias. So what we're going to do today basically is give you an overview of some of the studies we have done so far as a team. We've worked together and also with colleagues, Cristina Gorella, Julia Hill, Chloe Nelson in the room, Giorgio Aiuto. We've done work together for a couple of years, and we will present some of the findings of the studies we've done so far today. So first of all, we'll talk about an international review of the international policy to see what in policy documents, how outreach is described and how it is encouraged, and what the aims and motivations of science outreach are. Next, we'll talk about an empirical study where we interviewed scientists in Australia who are involved in various ways, in various roles in science outreach. And finally, we will present some of the results of an ongoing empirical study on the impact of a particular science outreach program on young students in rural Victoria. So that's the 3 studies basically that we will be presenting. And I will now hand over to Victoria to talk about the policy review.
Thanks, yeah. Okay, so the first part of the study we're going to talk about is the policy analysis we've done of science outreach. And this came about, I think, because we were trying to understand really what the driving motivations and incentives for science outreach were. So we could see that these outreach programs were becoming incredibly prolific, but at the same time, exactly what the underlying assumptions and motivations for this proliferation was not necessarily clear. So we were looking to the policy as one way of trying to understand this, because we knew that there's a lot of incentivization of science outreach through government initiatives and science funding as well. So I suppose we were trying to work out exactly what is the problem that science outreach is trying to address. And the way we did this is we did a policy analysis using Bucky's WPR approach, which I won't go into here, but this provides a way of analysing policy documents to understand what the problem is represented to be inside policy. And we did this analysis across science outreach policies in the European Union, UK, USA, Australia, and global organisations such as the OECD, UN-based organisations. Now, the framework that we have used for both this and the scientist paper has come out of this research by Peter Weingart, he does like sociology of science, writes some really interesting stuff. But he wrote this paper with colleagues a few years ago now about more broadly that bigger umbrella of science engagement and what the motivations are for science engagement. Okay, and so given that this analysis was already done by him and his colleagues, we've pretty much taken this up as a way of trying to understand motivations within outreach through both the policy and then talked about by the scientists as well. So they came up with these different motivations for science outreach. So very quickly and broadly, democratization. So that is more empowering citizens to be a part of the scientific process. So democratizing science, you can do engagement and outreach to educate people. So that's more outward facing as a way of legitimizing science itself, so dealing with some of those public trust type issues. And then innovation, which is one of using the public or having the public being a way of increasing innovation in science itself. So it is more the public back into science as a means for inspiration, so inspiring and engaging people into science and STEM. And then we added this additional category, so not actually a Weingart category, but this increasing diversity. So specific to outreach, we found a lot of mention about not just inspiration broadly, but about inspiring and engaging very particular subsets of society, such as those underrepresented groups, so rural, gender, low SES type groups. So of the policies that we found across those different areas, just very quickly, we ended up only analysing 20 in total. And so this is a pretty quick way of looking at how these spread in terms of how they talk about the motivations and the need for introducing science outreach. And you'll see really that the majority fall into that category of we need to do science outreach because we need to inspire a future generation of scientists, STEM professionals, and we need to educate them about science STEM. All right. The other ones we saw less of, so democratization and legitimization of science, were mentioned very little in these policies recommending that we do science outreach, and we found innovation was not mentioned at all. So that idea of getting the public to inform back into science was not seen at all in policy. And interestingly, this is a big criticism of science engagement in general, is that it's often very one way, and that it probably needs to have more of a backwards and forwards. So very quickly, out of that analysis and using that Bucky framework, the main things that we found, and the paper that is currently under review goes much more into each of those Weingart categories one by one. But really, we found that primary motivation for the reason and justification for increased funding in science outreach programs is education and participation, but rarely is science outreach defined. So there's a lot of conceptual vagueness, which is another criticism of science engagement as well. And these motivations are incredibly aspirational. So how do these motivations of increasing future participation match up with a one-off program where you're going into schools and doing a talk? So there's sometimes this mismatch. There's also little advice out there as to what science outreach should look like in practice. How do we know if we're meeting our aims? And this also aligns with our work in terms of our systematic lit review, and that is that we don't really know if outreach programs are succeeding in meeting these aspirational aims. There hasn't been a lot of research. And I suppose that's kind of comes into the next part of the research we're doing, and that is that we're trying to look at collecting some of that empirical data into science outreach practice and impact. So I'll hand over to Maurice now to talk about the work we've done with scientists.
Thank you. Thank you. So as Jan was introduced the topic of science outreach, we see science outreach as being a subset of engagement more broadly. And of course, the Weingart paper sort of stresses the point that science engagement has been a sort of massive kind of industry for 20 years, certainly since the early 2000s. There's been a kind of push to try and get the general public engaged with sort of scientific ideas for the sake of overcoming issues around trust with science, controversies around science, but also ensuring that there's kind of a continuation with the scientific workforce. So what this means is that there has been now decades of sustained and prolific engagement with the public by scientists, and so that does provide us with a kind of a good source of accounts and stories and experiences of science outreach. And so what we've done is looked at the work of some scientists who have been involved in some science outreach programs, some of them more established than others, and scientists who are coming from different scientific disciplines across physics, chemistry, biology, more specialized work around particle physics, for example, and or material sciences and chemistry. But these outreach programs run by these institutions are sort of engaging these different disciplines, but also I think they're kind of representative of the diversity of projects that are out there. And also, I think one thing that's quite important in terms of the 14 participants in our research, that these scientists also come with different biographies in terms of their experience of outreach, either establishing outreach programs, developing, delivering them. And so that's really quite important to show that not all scientists are the same and not all involved in outreach in the same way. And one thing that will come up, I guess, is the fact that because the scientists are also of different generations and have different motivations for their science outreach, that's going to be an important thing to distinguish this. So what we're trying to do really is say, if Weingart et al. Are producing, have these 5 motivations that capture engagement, what does it look like in terms of practice of amongst scientists in these outreach programs? Do their motivations align with that? Are they different because of their own experiences and so on? So that meant that what we were interested in is collecting information and stories about their involvement in the outreach, their motivations, and really how they saw how they addressed the challenges of doing outreach at work, and their own kind of perception of strengths and weaknesses, and thinking about the audience as well. So we tried to keep the questions, extend the questions beyond what was already in the outreach literature to try and capture these aspects. And so in some sense, what we're trying to do is match the macro level 5 levels of engagement, democratization, education, innovation, inspiration, and innovation, yes. And I'll explain why we always forget innovation. And so they've got these macro level motivations, and then just to see how that shows up in terms of their own accounts of this. And so we had these interviews with the scientists, again, variety of scientists working in a variety of projects, well-established or emerging or developing, and looking at their responses. The first thing that should be said, and I think this also reflects the policy space and to some extent the literature review, and that is that aspects of democratization, legitimation, and innovation are not discussed at any great length or any great detail by the scientists. In terms of democratization, there are a few scientists who hinted at the idea that outreach should engage students with thinking about the social problems, moving into kind of issues of contestation, of controversy, and using those to show the place of politics, of the political and democratic process. But they were quite rare. And it's also interesting to note that the scientist participant who spoke about the need to talk about climate change and issues like that also emphasized that we need to sort of shape the narrative in a particular way to tell positive stories about science. So when democracy comes in, there's also this issue of what's the story that needs to be told there in terms of the politics of science. Two things came out of the process of legitimization. The first is just, and again, it didn't occur very frequently, but when it did, there was again this emphasis on the need for developing trust. Outreach as a way of securing and developing trust amongst young people, trust in science and scientific expertise. But the other thing that emerged was this idea of accountability, and particularly financial accountability, where there's a social contract, scientists paid by the public, they're doing work for the public and public good, and they're using public money. And so legitimacy is also about showing that we're using that money correctly. And innovation, again, is one of those things that didn't show up except in one instance where there was a citizen science project. But otherwise, citizen science's innovation is wasn't a major feature of accounts. In the education space, in terms of introducing students to kind of scientific literacy and understanding about scientific concepts, I think one of the major themes that came out was the idea of novelty, of bringing something new to students which would not have been available ordinarily through the formal curriculum or through pedagogy and so on. So there's a real emphasis on bringing something that is kind of novel to students and also to teachers. And that could be either in the sense of cutting edge science, or it could be established science, but established science which is more abstract, harder to visualize and conceptualize. So again, something that an approach to that topic which might not ordinarily happen in the classroom. So novelty was an important aspect. Also, in terms of the more applied outreach programs that had applied context, novel applications was a way of thinking about that. And finally, something which emerged from our cohort of participants was the importance of curricular development, the idea that outreach can be used as a tool for developing curriculum and extending the curriculum. And finally, in terms of inspiration, again, novelty, this idea of the mysterious, access to scientific culture, what does it mean to be a scientist, talking to scientists, engaging with them as people, was a way of inspiring young people. Likewise with interesting applications of science. But one of the key features is this idea that pathways into science and scientific identity, there was an acknowledgement by some of the scientists that a science identity relating to science was just one identity amongst many for young people. And so, in conclusion, knowledge is important. Novelty is a major feature of that. So it's new knowledge, exciting, cutting edge knowledge, which is important. But again, there's still this general model of a unidirectional model of outreach. But one of the interesting findings is the idea that there was great appreciation among some of the scientists for the work of teachers and their understanding students and the curriculum. And as I was saying before, the idea that outreach could be involved in curriculum reform is quite important. And I think one of the key features is the idea of scientific identity, that there's just not one identity. So in terms of recruitment, the pipeline model of recruitment, there's a more subtle idea emerging of science as one identity, one pathway into future engagement with science, and that I think is kind of an interesting finding, and I think it also relates to the work on the rural placement of some of these outreach programs, which Vic will talk to in a moment. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, so alongside this work with the scientists and the policy and the lit review, we are also taking some work with a couple of science outreach programs, trying to look at long-term influence of science outreach, particularly on how students identify with science. And the reason we've gone down with this pathway in particular is because of that big motivation being around attracting students into science. And so we are using this idea of identity as being a way of trying to capture some signal of longer-term influence of science outreach on students' participation and engagement with science. So in order to do that, we are not just trying to see, does it influence it, but also trying to understand what are the small interactions that are happening during an outreach program that create that influence. So trying to match, okay, we're seeing some change. What is it that's happening inside that science outreach program itself that may be creating change? Understanding that it might not necessarily be the content itself, it might be more the interactions that develop between scientists and students, for examples, or that teacher or the community more broadly. So this is why we have kind of taken this using the social material alongside identity as a way of understanding this. We are currently, so just a bit of an aside so that I won't go into a lot. So using science identity to try and understand that, which is a fairly well-developed idea in science education these days. Also, this idea of place has come up as incredibly important in relation to one of the science outreach programs. And to capture that material social practice, we're using Shatsky's practice theory. And maybe we can talk more about those another time. So just concentrating on one science outreach program that we are working with at the moment, but also acknowledging that we've got other collaborations, hopefully just starting as well with other outreach programs, because I could see some of them are online. So we're very excited about those. But this one in particular that we're much further down the line with is a project we've started with the Centre of Excellence for Dark Matter Particle Physics. And this is really a big international effort to try and detect dark matter. And as part of this, there's been a large laboratory that has been built in the gold mine in rural Victorian Stawell. And so a lot of the science outreach that is a part of this Centre of Excellence is sitting around that rural location in the secondary schools up around Stawell. So the interesting thing about the Centres of Excellence for us is it provides an interesting snapshot in that a lot of the Centres of Excellence, so for pure science discovery, require that there is a science engagement component as part of that funding. So what we're seeing is an uptick of all of these Centres of Excellence, including a lot of science outreach as part of their big grant funding. So a lot of these big 7-year Centres of Excellence are very well funded and have a well-funded science outreach component of that. So the dark matter particle physics one is a good example of that. And given that they run for 7 years, it also allows us to duck in there for on repeat over a longer time period. So just a bit about the outreach program itself, acknowledging that every outreach program is quite different. So we're very lucky to be able to work with Jackie Bondell, who is the outreach coordinator for this program, who is very experienced in this space. And she pretty much runs an outreach program alongside some of the PhD students in the physics departments across the country that are as part of the Centre of Excellence. And they deliver classes once a year over that 5-year period in the same schools. So what we see is her returning every year to the same schools, all the way from years 7 to 11. So those students get to know Jackie and the other members of that science outreach team. And the focus largely is on the lab itself. So the gold mine, why there's a lab in the gold mine, what is dark matter. But of course, dark matter is a bit of a strange concept in itself. It's quite hard for people to get their head across, particularly at those lower levels of secondary school. And so it raises a lot of interesting questions about the nature of science itself. How do we know what we know? How do we detect something that we can't see or interact with very well? And all of those kinds of questions. What is normal matter? What is dark matter? And so on. So some really interesting science that she's trying to bring into those classrooms, which raises some nice contemporary science curriculum questions as well. So really the data we've collected on this project so far is just a couple of years of data. So we will continue to go back into those classrooms for the next 3 years, which is fantastic. And so far we've undertaken focus groups with 52 students aged between 13 and 16-year-old, also interviews with teachers, and we've gone in and observed the programs running quite frequently. And so, of course, as I mentioned before, the 3 schools that we're working with are all in rural secondary areas. And so this really lets us see how this is affecting their identity as groups of students that we know are less likely to go into science in the first place. So these are just some very initial findings, and I'll talk through these fairly quickly. So not surprisingly, given that we know that often the biggest predictor of pathways for young people in terms of where they end up is that they reproduce what they see around them. And when we talk to young people, we absolutely see that there is this reproduction of young people in these rural towns wanting to go into what would be seen as fairly traditional and well-known pathways for those areas. So wanting to do what their grandfather did, what they know that their father does, their mother does, and other people that they know in their immediate circle. Okay. We did find that those students who identify strongly as science people also identify more strongly with the science outreach program itself, which is not surprising. And also one of the possible criticisms of science outreach is that it tends to talk to people who already like science. And so I suppose what we're trying to do is see how we're capturing people outside that group who were probably already turned on and switched on and likely to go down that pathway anyway. which is another reason often we increasingly encourage science outreach to start earlier rather than later. All right, so another one is the general positive influence of science outreach. So regardless of whether or not students were going to go on and change their mind about becoming scientists, what we really want to see is actually smaller signals of change, which we see are more likely. So smaller nudges towards seeing science as something for them. So in general, we did find that the students were finding a very positive experience interacting with scientists and having those scientists come back into their classroom. So they really looked forward to having those people come back and having that science taught in a slightly different way than what would be happening in their regular classroom environment. And interesting for us in these initial stages of analysis is for this very particular program where we have a laboratory located in rural Victoria, is how important that laboratory is to the local population. All right, and this raises all sorts of fascinating questions about the way we tend to put our science workforce, I think, in Australia is very much driven by capital cities. And here what we see is that because of the location of the science itself, a lot of students are seeing value in this science outreach program in a way that was possibly not going to happen if that laboratory was not located in their local community. And similarly to this, the teachers were interested in being part of the outreach program only because of that laboratory itself. And for those people who work with schools and know how busy teachers are, you would know that it's often hard for outreach programs to find schools that want to take up outreach. So it's interesting to see the reasons why teachers think that that locality and the science lab itself is such an important reason for bringing on these science outreach programs. Not necessarily reproducible for other science outreach programs, but an interesting science outcome for that one in particular. So, I mean, this work for us is still in its very early days. And as I said before, we're not imagining that the science outreach program is going to create massive change in people's views amongst all of the other things in people's lives that influence their decisions for pathways. But we do hope to see some smaller signs that how students identify with science is changing as a result. And we think that we are starting to see some signals that some of these smaller nudges are happening. For this one in particular, the role of place is coming through as very important. And again, place is part of the context for young people. That we need to take into account for why young people make choices about what they're going to do. And some interesting findings coming out connecting rural students with science in a country like Australia. So given this is a longitudinal study, we hope that we'll start to be able to work through this more, and also hoping to do similar work with other science outreach programs as well. So just to finish off, was this my slide? I can't. Yeah, we'll make. Okay, so I mean, all of this work that we're doing around science outreach has been really fascinating. I think it holds so much potential, and there is so much work being done in science outreach. It's absolutely amazing. And I suppose what we're hoping to do is move the field forward in developing some approaches that allow us to see better and understand whether science outreach is meeting those big aims that it's really setting out to do. And we think this is really important for a whole lot of reasons that everyone in this room would be very familiar with. You know, we consider science to be important for a lot of reasons, particularly for the public in an era of misinformation and trust. We hope to do a bit more work with scientists in terms of understanding motivations and benefits for sciences. So we do increasingly hear a lot of scientists talk about how being a part of outreach was really influential on their own career plans and choices. So here we see influences on career changes for scientists, not just for students, which is interesting. So moving into teaching or doing more outreach or more engagement, or, you know, ending up in all sorts of places as a result of being part of science outreach programs. Really looking to understand more about the influence of science outreach on all sorts of underrepresented students. And we do hope to very much turn this into a more practical framework that feeds back into advice for funders and outreach providers in terms of what good and influential outreach should include as well. So we will leave it there. We managed to do it on time.
Perfect, yeah.
Yep. So thank you very much.